"Julian, darling, you seem nervous." Julian Jennings forced his trembling hands to steady as he signed the hotel registry, the gold pen slipping against his sweaty palm. Beside him, Cassandra Vale pressed her manicured fingers against his shoulder, her touch burning through his expensive shirt like a brand of guilt. "I'm not nervous," he lied, his voice catching on the words. "Just excited for our weekend." But nervous didn't even begin to cover the chaos erupting in his chest. His heart hammered against his ribs like a caged animal desperate for escape. 3 lies. He'd told Sloane 3 carefully constructed lies to make this weekend possible, and each one felt like swallowing broken glass. Business conference in Atlanta. Boring legal seminars. Back Sunday night, sweetheart. The memory of his wife's trusting smile as she kissed his cheek goodbye made his stomach twist into knots. Sloane had even packed his favorite ties, folding them with the same meticulous care she brought to everything in their perfectly ordered life. "The presidential suite, sir?" The concierge's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. "Right this way." Cassandra's laugh tinkled like expensive crystal as she slipped her arm through his, her red dress a slash of color against the hotel's marble elegance. At 32, she was everything Sloane wasn't: bold, demanding, impossible to ignore. Where his wife spoke in whispers, Cassandra commanded attention. Where Sloane wore sensible cardigans, Cassandra draped herself in silk that clung to curves designed to destroy marriages. "This place is incredible, Julian." Her eyes swept the soaring ceiling of the Palmetto Crown's lobby, taking in the crystal chandeliers and gleaming floors. "How did you even know about it?" He didn't answer, couldn't answer. Because the truth was, he'd chosen this hotel precisely because it was new, exclusive, and most importantly, somewhere Sloane would never think to look for him. His quiet, bookish wife with her library volunteer work and evening tea habits wouldn't even know places like this existed. The elevator climbed silently toward the 20th floor, each passing number feeling like a countdown to his damnation. Cassandra stood pressed against his side, her perfume, something dark and expensive, clouding his judgment the way it had for the past 6 months. 6 months. Had it really been that long since their first kiss in his law firm's conference room? 6 months of stolen afternoons, fabricated business dinners, and lies that came easier each time he told them? "You're thinking about her again." Cassandra's voice held an edge that made him look down at her. "Your mousy little wife. Don't call her that." The words came out sharper than he intended, surprising them both. Cassandra's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose, and for a moment, something dangerous flashed in her green eyes. "Protective of the woman you're cheating on? How noble, Julian." The elevator dinged softly as they reached their floor, and Julian felt the weight of that accusation settle around his shoulders like lead. Cheating. The word he'd carefully avoided for months, dancing around it with justifications about growing apart, about passion, about deserving happiness. But walking down this hallway toward a weekend of lies, with Cassandra's heels clicking against marble like a countdown to disaster, he couldn't escape what he'd become. The presidential suite door swung open to reveal windows spanning the entire wall, the city sprawling below them like a glittering carpet of lights. Champagne waited on ice, rose petals scattered across silk sheets, everything orchestrated for seduction. Perfect. Cassandra kicked off her heels and moved toward the windows, her reflection ghost-like in the darkening glass. Absolutely perfect. But Julian couldn't move from the doorway. Something felt wrong, not morally wrong. He'd made peace with that months ago, but practically wrong. A crawling sensation between his shoulder blades, like invisible eyes watching him. His phone buzzed. A text from Sloane. "Hope your conference is going well. Don't work too hard. Love you." The champagne glass in his hand might as well have been filled with acid. "Julian." Cassandra turned from the window, her expression softening into something that might have been concern if he didn't know better. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," he thought, staring at his phone. "Maybe I'm looking at the ghost of the man I used to be." "Hey, my friend, hope you're doing well. Drop a comment and let me know how you're feeling about this story so far and where you are watching from. If you haven't already, please click that subscribe button because tomorrow I have an even more special story for you, and I do not want you to miss it. The truth was, Julian Jennings had always been a careful man. Careful with his investments, careful with his words, careful with his reputation as one of the city's most respected corporate attorneys. But standing in that hotel room, watching Cassandra pour champagne with the casual confidence of a woman who'd never questioned her right to take what she wanted, He realized he'd made the first truly reckless decision of his 45-year-old life. And he was about to discover just how catastrophically wrong careful men could be when they finally decided to throw caution to the wind. The champagne tasted like regret, but he drank it anyway, because turning back now felt impossible. Because 6 months of secret meetings and whispered promises had led them here, to this moment, to this room, to this terrible, wonderful mistake that would change everything. What Julian didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as he set down his glass and moved toward the woman who'd been slowly destroying his marriage one stolen kiss at a time, was that the Palmetto Crown wasn't just any hotel. And the woman he'd lied to, the quiet wife he'd dismissed as too ordinary to ever suspect his betrayal, wasn't just any woman. In exactly 12 hours, everything Julian Jennings thought he knew about his life would shatter like champagne crystal against marble floors. But for now, in this suspended moment before the storm, he pulled Cassandra into his arms and tried to drown the voice in his head whispering that some mistakes can never be undone. The city lights twinkled below them, beautiful and cold as diamonds. And somewhere in that glittering darkness, wheels were already turning that would transform his perfect crime into his perfect downfall. The champagne had gone flat hours ago, but Julian kept drinking it anyway, the bubbles long dead like the promises he'd made at his wedding altar 8 years ago. Cassandra lay curled against his chest, her breathing soft and even, but sleep eluded him completely. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sloane's face, not angry or suspicious, just trusting. Always trusting. It hadn't always been this way. When he'd first met Sloane Armand at a charity gala 5 years before their wedding, she'd been anything but quiet. She'd been giving a speech about literacy programs, commanding the room with an eloquence that left him breathless. Her dark hair had been swept up in an elegant chignon, diamonds glittering at her throat, and when she'd caught his eye across the crowded ballroom, her smile had hit him like lightning. "Who is she?" he'd asked the colleague standing beside him. "Sloane Armand. Old money, older name. Her family's been in hospitality for generations." But by the time Julian worked up the courage to approach her, something had changed in her demeanor. The commanding presence had dimmed, replaced by something softer, more careful. She'd smiled when he introduced himself, but it was a different smile, smaller, more contained. "I enjoyed your speech," he'd said, and she ducked her head like the compliment embarrassed her. "Oh, I'm not really a public speaker. I just got roped into it tonight." Even then, something had niggled at the back of his mind. The woman who'd held that room captive for 10 minutes claiming she wasn't a public speaker? But Julian had been too smitten to question it, too eager to win over this beautiful, mysterious woman who seemed to shrink under attention, yet captivated everyone she met. Their courtship had been a study in contradictions. Sloane would mention offhandedly that she needed to check on some properties, then change the subject when he asked for details. She'd receive urgent phone calls that made her speak in rapid, authoritative tones, then hang up and apologize for boring business stuff. Once, he'd glimpsed her signature on a document, bold, sweeping letters that looked nothing like the hesitant woman who claimed she wasn't good at making decisions. But love, Julian had learned, made men willfully blind. After their wedding, the contradictions had only multiplied. Sloane would disappear for volunteer work that seemed to require an awful lot of expensive suits. She'd mention casually that she'd helped out with some business deal, then deflect when he pressed for details. Their home, which she'd somehow acquired fully furnished before their marriage, was decorated with a sophistication that seemed at odds with someone who claimed to have no head for business. The turning point had come 6 months ago, the night that would eventually lead him to this hotel room, this betrayal, this moment of reckoning he couldn't see approaching. Julian had been working late at his firm when Cassandra Vale had walked into his office. Not unusual. She was opposing counsel on a merger case, and they'd been negotiating for weeks. But that night, she'd brought wine instead of legal briefs. "We've been working ourselves to death on this case," she'd said, settling into the chair across from his desk with feline grace. "I thought we deserved a break." He should have said no. Should have cited professional ethics, mentioned his wife, maintained the boundaries that had kept his marriage intact for 8 years. Instead, he'd found himself studying the way the lamplight caught the gold in Cassandra's hair, the way her green eyes seemed to see straight through his professional composure to something hungry underneath. "My husband thinks I'm at book club," she'd said after her second glass, and something in her tone made Julian's pulse quicken. "Book club? Every Thursday night. Jane Austen Society." Her laugh had been bitter. He thinks I'm this sweet, domestic little thing who reads romance novels and arranges flowers. He has no idea who I really am. The parallel to his own life had been too obvious to ignore. Julian had thought of Sloane at home, probably curled up with one of her endless library books, waiting for him to return from another late night at the office. "What are you really?" he'd asked, and Cassandra's smile had been sharp enough to cut glass. Dangerous. 3 hours later, Julian had broken his wedding vows for the first time, Cassandra's mouth hot against his in the darkness of his office. The guilt had been crushing, but underneath it ran something else, a thrill he hadn't felt in years. The excitement of being wanted not as a provider or protector, but as a man worth risking everything for. "I should go," he'd said afterward, but Cassandra had caught his hand. "Julian." Her voice had been soft, vulnerable in a way that made his chest tight. "I need you to know, this isn't just some affair for me. I've been in a loveless marriage for 3 years. My husband sees me as decoration, something pretty to wear on his arm at dinner parties. You're the first person who's looked at me like I'm real." The words had hit him like a physical blow, because they described exactly how he'd felt for months. When had Sloane stopped really seeing him? When had their conversations become limited to schedules and household maintenance? When had he become invisible in his own home? Now, lying in this hotel room with Cassandra's warmth against his side, Julian tried to pinpoint the exact moment his marriage had died. Was it when Sloane had started spending more time volunteering? When she'd begun deflecting his questions about her day? When she'd stopped initiating physical intimacy, claiming she was tired from work? Work she claimed was just part-time charity coordination. A soft knock at the door made Julian's entire body tense. Cassandra stirred against him, mumbling something incoherent, but didn't wake. The knock came again, more insistent. Julian slipped out of bed, pulling on his robe as he padded toward the door. It was nearly midnight. Who could possibly be knocking at this hour? Through the peephole, he saw a hotel employee in crisp uniform, holding what looked like an envelope. "Yes," Julian called through the door. "Complimentary champagne service, sir. From the new management." "New management?" Julian frowned but unlocked the door, keeping the chain engaged so it would only open a few inches. The young man, probably early 20s with nervous eyes, held out an envelope through the gap. "What's this?" "A personal note from the new owner, sir. She wanted all presidential suite guests to receive a special welcome." Something cold crawled up Julian's spine. "She?" "Yes, sir. The new chairwoman. She just took over operations yesterday. Very hands-on from what I hear. Knows everything about every guest." Julian's hands shook as he took the envelope, his name written across it in handwriting that looked disturbingly familiar. The hotel employee was already walking away, leaving Julian staring at the elegant script that reminded him of wedding invitations and anniversary cards. Inside the envelope was a single card, cream-colored and expensive. The message was brief. "Welcome to the Palmetto Crown. We hope your stay exceeds all expectations. Some surprises are worth waiting for. S.A.J." The initials hit Julian like ice water. S.A.J. Sloane Armand Jennings. But that was impossible. Sloane was at home, probably asleep with one of her books open on her chest, completely unaware that her husband was 20 floors above the city with another woman. She didn't know anything about hotels or business ownership or... The card slipped from Julian's nerveless fingers, fluttering to the marble floor like a dying bird. Because suddenly, horribly, all those contradictions from their marriage began arranging themselves into a pattern that made terrible sense. The mysterious phone calls. The expensive clothes she claimed were borrowed from friends. The way she'd somehow acquired their house, fully furnished, without ever explaining where the money came from. Her casual mentions of helping with business deals. Sloane Armand. Old money, older name. Her family's been in hospitality for generations. The memory of his colleague's words from that charity gala 8 years ago crashed over him like a tsunami. Hospitality. Hotels. Julian's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the couch, staring at the card on the floor as understanding dawned like a sunrise he'd been too blind to see coming. His quiet, bookish wife, the woman he'd dismissed as too ordinary to ever suspect his betrayal, wasn't a part-time volunteer who arranged flowers and read romance novels. She was Sloane Armand. And if the initials on this card were any indication, she wasn't just connected to the hospitality industry. She owned it. Behind him, Cassandra stirred in the bed, her voice thick with sleep. "Julian? What are you doing? Come back to bed." But Julian couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Couldn't do anything except stare at those 3 little letters that had just rewritten everything he thought he knew about his life. S.A.J. Sloane Armand Jennings. His wife. The new owner of the Palmetto Crown. The woman he'd lied to in order to bring his mistress to her hotel. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the city, and Julian realized with crystal clarity that the storm he'd been feeling approach all evening wasn't coming. It was already here. Julian stared at the card on the marble floor until his vision blurred. S.A.J. 3 letters that had just rewritten his entire understanding of reality. Behind him, Cassandra stirred in the bed. "Julian? What are you doing? Come back to bed." But Julian couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except sit on that couch and feel his world collapse around him. The woman he'd married, the quiet, bookish wife he'd thought he could deceive so easily, was Sloane Armand. Not just connected to the hospitality industry. She was the hospitality industry. He spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through 8 years of marriage like a detective examining evidence he'd been too stupid to see. Every memory felt contaminated now, every conversation reframed through this new lens of understanding. By sunrise, he'd convinced himself he was wrong. Paranoid. The initials were a coincidence. They had to be. S.A.J. could be anyone. Stephen Andrew Johnson. Susan and Jackson. Anyone except his wife, who was probably at home right now making her morning tea and arranging her volunteer schedule. Cassandra woke to find him fully dressed, pacing the length of the presidential suite like a caged animal. "You're up early," she purred, stretching in bed like a satisfied cat. "Come here. Let me make your morning more interesting. I need to make a phone call." "To who?" Her voice sharpened with suspicion. "Your wife." Julian's hands shook as he dialed Sloane's number. It went straight to voicemail, her voice soft and familiar. "You've reached Sloane. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you soon." Simple. Normal. The voice of a woman who volunteered at libraries and made grocery lists on the backs of envelopes. Not the voice of someone who owned a luxury hotel empire. "Sloane, it's me. Just wanted to hear your voice. The conference is going well. Call me back when you get this." Cassandra was watching him with growing irritation. "Julian, you're acting insane. It's one weekend. She doesn't own you." But that was exactly what Julian was beginning to fear. That maybe Sloane owned more than he'd ever imagined. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Presidential suite guests are invited to the exclusive chairwoman's brunch at 11 a.m. La Aurelia restaurant. Attendances highly encouraged. Hotel management." Julian's blood turned to ice. "We need to leave. Now." "What? Why?" Cassandra sat up, the sheet falling away. "We just got here. I had plans for this morning that involved you, me, and room service. Something's wrong. This place, this hotel. You're being ridiculous." Cassandra's voice took on the sharp edge he'd learned meant she was done being patient. "I canceled my entire weekend for you. I lied to my husband, arranged for my sister to cover for me, bought new lingerie that cost more than most people's rent. We are not leaving because you're having some paranoid breakdown about your wife." The argument that followed was vicious, voices raised despite the early hour. Cassandra accused him of being weak, of letting his wife control him even when she wasn't there. Julian found himself defending Sloane. "She's not controlling, she's just..." But how could he finish that sentence? Just what? Just secretly running a business empire while pretending to be a housewife? By 10:30, they'd reached an uneasy truce. Cassandra had convinced him that leaving would look suspicious, that going to one hotel brunch couldn't possibly matter. She'd reminded him that he was a successful attorney, not some guilty teenager sneaking around. "Besides," she'd said, applying lipstick with practiced precision, "what's the worst that could happen? Your wife magically appears and discovers us? She's probably at home reading Jane Austen and planning a grocery list." At 10:58 a.m., Julian Jennings walked into La Aurelia restaurant with his mistress on his arm, wearing his best suit like armor against a threat he couldn't name. The restaurant was stunning, floor-to-ceiling windows, crystal chandeliers, tables set with white linens and fresh orchids. Perhaps 20 other guests mingled with champagne flutes, the city's elite from what Julian could see. That was his first clue something was terribly wrong. These weren't random hotel guests. These were people Julian recognized, prominent businessmen, society wives, influential attorneys from rival firms. People who mattered in their small world of power and reputation. Julian Jennings? A young woman with a clipboard approached them. "Welcome to the Palmetto Crown. If you'd please take your seats, the chairwoman will be addressing everyone shortly. They were seated at a table near the front, with an unobstructed view of the small podium where a microphone waited. Julian's palms sweated against his champagne flute as he scanned the room, trying to understand why he felt like he was walking into an ambush. Cassandra, oblivious to his growing panic, was in her element. She charmed their tablemates, a judge and his wife, a prominent real estate developer, with stories about her humanitarian work in South America. Julian barely heard the conversation over the roaring in his ears. At exactly 11:15, the lights dimmed slightly, and a woman's voice came over the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the new chairwoman of Armand Hospitality Group." Julian's world tilted sideways. Armand Hospitality Group. Armand. Sloane Armand. The woman who walked onto the small stage wasn't the Sloane who had kissed him goodbye yesterday morning. This woman moved with the confidence of someone who commanded boardrooms and made million-dollar decisions before lunch. Her dark hair was swept into a sophisticated chignon, and she wore a tailored black suit that probably cost more than Julian's car. Diamond earrings caught the light as she approached the microphone, and when she smiled at the assembled guests, it was the smile of someone who owned the room and everything in it, including, Julian realized with dawning horror, him. "Thank you all for joining me this morning," Sloane said, her voice carrying clearly through the restaurant. Gone was the soft, hesitant tone he'd grown accustomed to. This was the voice of the woman from that charity gala 8 years ago, commanding, articulate, utterly in control. "I'm thrilled to officially announce my acquisition of the Palmetto Crown, the newest jewel in the Armand Hospitality portfolio. This property represents not just an investment in luxury accommodations, but a commitment to excellence in every detail." Julian couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process the reality that his quiet wife, the woman who claimed to volunteer at libraries and avoid public speaking, was standing at a podium addressing the city's power brokers like she'd been born to it, which, he realized with growing dread, she probably had been. "Some of you may be wondering about the timing of this acquisition," Sloane continued, and Julian could have sworn her eyes found his across the room. "The Palmetto Crown came available at exactly the right moment. Sometimes the universe provides opportunities we simply can't refuse." Cassandra had gone very still beside him. "Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That woman. She looks familiar." "As we move forward," Sloane was saying, "I want to assure all our guests that Armand Hospitality Group values discretion above all else. We believe in transparency in our business dealings and complete privacy in our personal services." The words hit Julian like physical blows. Discretion. Privacy. Personal services. She knew. Somehow, impossibly, Sloane knew exactly where he was and why he was here. "In fact," Sloane continued, and now Julian was certain she was looking directly at him, "we've prepared special welcome packages for some of our more notable guests this weekend. Couples who've chosen the Palmetto Crown for particularly intimate occasions." Julian's throat closed completely. Around him, the other guests murmured politely, but their words sounded like they were coming from underwater. He was drowning in plain sight, suffocating on the realization that his perfect crime had been a trap from the very beginning. "Julian." Cassandra's grip on his arm was painfully tight. "I know where I've seen her. That's your wife. That's your fucking wife." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. On stage, Sloane smiled brilliantly at the assembled crowd. "Now, I'd love to meet with each of you personally. Starting with table 7. Julian looked down at the small number placard in front of his champagne flute. Table 7. His legs turned to water. "Mr. and Mrs. Jennings," Sloane said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent restaurant. "Would you please join me for a private conversation?" Every head in the restaurant turned toward their table. Julian felt the weight of 24 stares, the collective intake of breath as the city's elite realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Beside him, Cassandra had gone white as the tablecloth. And at the podium, Sloane Armand Jennings, not the quiet housewife he'd married, but the hotel heiress he'd never bothered to truly know, waited with the patience of someone who held all the cards and was finally ready to play them. Julian's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The conference room is ready for our meeting. Don't keep me waiting. Your wife." The point of no return had arrived, and Julian realized with crystalline clarity that he'd been racing toward this moment since the second he'd walked into this hotel. Every choice, every lie, every moment of willful blindness had led him here, to this table, facing the woman he'd underestimated so catastrophically that it would destroy everything he thought he knew about his life. "Shall we?" Sloane called from the podium, her smile sharp as broken glass. And Julian Jennings, successful attorney and faithless husband, stood on trembling legs to face the reckoning he'd never seen coming. The walk from table 7 to the private elevator felt like a death march. Julian's legs moved without conscious direction, carrying him past the staring faces of the city's most influential people. Judges who'd ruled on his cases, business leaders who'd hired his firm, society wives who played tennis with Cassandra's friends. Each face registered recognition, curiosity, and the particular brand of anticipation that comes with witnessing someone else's downfall. Cassandra stumbled beside him, her designer heels clicking erratically against the marble floor. "This isn't happening," she whispered, her voice brittle with panic. "This can't be happening." But Sloane was already at the elevator, holding the door with one manicured hand. Up close, the transformation was even more shocking. This wasn't just confidence. This was authority so natural it seemed to radiate from her bones. The woman Julian had thought he'd married looked like a pale imitation beside this version of his wife. "Cassandra." Sloane's voice was warm, almost friendly. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Sloane Jennings, Julian's wife." The words hung in the elevator's confined space like poison gas. Cassandra's face cycled through emotions: shock, embarrassment, defiance, and finally, a calculating hardness that Julian had never seen before. "I know who you are," Cassandra said, lifting her chin. "The question is, what do you want?" Sloane's smile could have powered the city. "Accountability." The elevator climbed silently to the 22nd floor. Executive level, Julian noticed numbly. Of course she had an executive office in her own hotel. Of course she'd been running a business empire while he'd been patting himself on the back for supporting his volunteer work. The office that awaited them was stunning, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a conference table that could seat 20, walls lined with awards and photographs that Julian now realized chronicled a career he'd been too blind to see. In one photo, a younger Sloane shook hands with the mayor at some ribbon-cutting ceremony. In another, she stood beside a massive hotel under construction, wearing a hard hat and that same confident smile. "Please sit." Sloane gestured to chairs across from her massive desk. "We have so much to discuss." Julian's mouth felt like sand. "Sloane, I can explain." "Can you?" She settled into her chair with the grace of someone who'd been conducting high-stakes meetings since before Julian had learned to lie effectively. "I'm fascinated to hear your explanation for why you told me you were attending a legal conference in Atlanta while booking the presidential suite of my hotel with your mistress." The words hit like physical blows. Julian felt Cassandra flinch beside him. "Your hotel?" Cassandra's voice was sharp with disbelief. "You're claiming you own the Palmetto Crown?" Instead of answering, Sloane pressed a button on her desk phone. "Marcus, please bring up the ownership documents for the Palmetto Crown, along with the registration records for the presidential suite from this weekend." A man in his 50s appeared within seconds, clearly her assistant, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd worked with Sloane for years. He placed a stack of legal documents in front of her, then retreated without a word. "The Palmetto Crown," Sloane said, sliding the first document across the desk, "was acquired by Armand Hospitality Group 6 months ago. I am the sole owner and chairwoman of Armand Hospitality Group, a position I've held since my father's retirement 3 years ago." Julian stared at the document, his legal training automatically parsing the complex language. It was legitimate: property transfer, board resolutions, everything properly executed and notarized. The signature at the bottom was unmistakably Sloane's, but not the careful script he was used to seeing on grocery lists. This was the bold, authoritative signature of someone who signed million-dollar deals. "As for your weekend getaway," Sloane continued, sliding another document forward, "let me read from the guest registration. Julian and Cassandra Jennings, celebrating their wedding anniversary." Interesting choice, don't you think? The blood drained from Julian's face. Beside him, Cassandra made a sound like a wounded animal. I would never." "The registration was submitted online 3 weeks ago," Sloane continued relentlessly. "From your office computer, during business hours. You used your firm's credit card, the corporate account I've been quietly monitoring for the past 6 months. 6 months. The same time frame as his affair with Cassandra. Julian's mind reeled as he tried to process the implications. "You've been spying on me?" For the first time, Something flickered in Sloane's composed expression. Not anger, something colder. I've been protecting myself, Julian. There's a difference. She opened another folder, revealing a stack of photographs that made Julian's stomach drop to his shoes. Him and Cassandra entering restaurants, kissing in the parking garage of his office building, holding hands during a lunch meeting that had turned personal. 6 months ago, you started working late more often. Credit card charges at restaurants you'd never mentioned. Receipts for flowers that never made it home. Sloane's voice remained perfectly level, but Julian could see her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of her desk. I hired a private investigator initially just to confirm what I already suspected. But then I discovered something interesting. She pulled out another set of documents, financial records that made Julian's blood turn to ice. Your law firm, Jennings & Associates, has been struggling financially for over a year. You've been using our joint accounts to cover operating expenses without telling me. The house payments, my car, even your expensive suits, all of it funded by Armand Hospitality Group profits. Julian felt like he was drowning in plain air. Sloane, the firm had some temporary cash flow issues. Temporary? Her laugh was sharp as broken glass. Julian, your firm is 3 months from bankruptcy. You've been stealing from our marriage to fund a business you're too proud to admit is failing, while simultaneously betraying that marriage with a woman you're also financially supporting. She slid another document across the desk. Credit card statements showing charges Julian recognized with growing horror. The necklace he'd bought Cassandra for her birthday. The weekend trips to wine country. The expensive lingerie she'd mentioned that morning. All paid for, Sloane continued, with money from a company you didn't even know I owned. Cassandra had been silent through this revelation, but now she exploded. This is insane. Julian, she's been manipulating you, spying on you. I've been supporting him, Sloane cut her off, her voice like ice. While he's been lying to me, stealing from me, and fucking you in hotels I own. The profanity was so unexpected, so unlike the Sloane Julian thought he knew, that it hit like a physical blow. This woman, articulate, powerful, utterly in control, was nothing like the quiet wife who read books and avoided confrontation. 6 months ago, Sloane continued, when I first discovered your affair, I had a choice. I could confront you, file for divorce, and watch you drag both our reputations through a very public, very ugly legal battle. Or, she paused, letting the word hang in the air like a sword. Or I could wait. Watch. Learn exactly who you'd become, and more importantly, who you'd always been underneath the man I thought I'd married. Julian's hands shook as the full scope of her orchestration became clear. The hotel. You bought this hotel knowing I'd bring her here. The Palmetto Crown came on the market at exactly the right time, Sloane confirmed. And yes, Julian, I knew you'd choose it. You always pick the newest, most exclusive option when you're trying to impress someone. It's one of the things I used to find endearing about you. The past tense hit Julian like a physical blow. This is entrapment, Cassandra said, but her voice lacked conviction. You can't manipulate people like this. Like what? Like providing my husband with the perfect venue for his infidelity? Like giving him exactly what he wanted? Sloane's smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. I didn't force Julian to lie to me. I didn't make him steal from our joint accounts. I certainly didn't make him bring his mistress to my hotel and register under our married name. She stood, moving to the window that overlooked the city. I simply gave him enough rope to hang himself with. The fact that he chose to weave it into a noose is entirely his decision. Julian felt the walls closing in around him. Every choice he'd made for the past 6 months had been observed, catalogued, documented. His perfect crime had been performed on a stage, with an audience of one who'd been taking notes the entire time. What do you want? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sloane turned from the window, and for just a moment, Julian saw a flash of the woman he'd married, vulnerable, hurt, human. Then the mask slipped back into place. I want my life back, Julian. The one you stole from me 6 months ago when you decided I wasn't enough anymore. She returned to her desk, pulling out one final document. Divorce papers. Already filed, already processed. Our marriage ended the moment you checked into my hotel with another woman, using our anniversary as your cover story. Julian stared at the legal documents, recognizing the language of dissolution, property division, and financial settlement. His signature line waited at the bottom, next to a pen that looked like it cost more than his monthly salary. If you sign now, quietly, you can walk out of here with your dignity mostly intact. Your law practice, what's left of it, can continue operating. You'll have enough money to start over somewhere else, maybe even rebuild your reputation eventually. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow seemed more dangerous than shouting. But if you fight me on this, Julian, if you try to claim I've manipulated or entrapped you, I will destroy not just you, but everyone you've ever cared about. Starting with the woman sitting beside you. Cassandra had gone very pale. What do you mean? Sloane's smile was winter cold. I mean, Mrs. Vale, that adultery is still grounds for divorce in this state. Your husband, a prominent businessman with political aspirations, if I'm not mistaken, might be very interested to know how you've been spending your Thursday evenings. Particularly since he's been funding them through the joint account you've been using to pay for your hotel rooms. The trap was complete, Julian realized. Not just for him, but for Cassandra too. Sloane had orchestrated this with the precision of a master chess player, anticipating every move, planning every counterattack. You're evil, Cassandra whispered. I'm thorough, Sloane corrected. There's a difference. The pen felt impossibly heavy in Julian's hand. 8 years of marriage, reduced to signatures on legal documents. A life built on lies, finally collapsing under the weight of truth. But as he stared at those papers, Julian realized something that chilled him more than all of Sloane's revelations combined. He didn't know this woman at all. The Sloane who'd planned this elaborate revenge, who'd built a business empire while playing the perfect wife, who'd turned his infidelity into her triumph. She was a stranger wearing his wife's face. Which meant that for 8 years, he'd been married to someone who didn't exist. And the real Sloane Armand Jennings was far more dangerous than any affair could ever be. The pen trembled in Julian's hand, hovering over the signature line like a sword above his own neck. Around him, the office had fallen into a silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled below, beautiful, indifferent, completely unaware that his entire world was ending 22 floors above the street. There's something else, Sloane said softly, and Julian's blood turned to ice. After everything she'd revealed, there was more? She pulled out a tablet, her fingers dancing across the screen with practiced efficiency. I think you should see this before you sign. The screen showed security footage, black and white, time-stamped from the hotel's cameras. Julian watched himself check in yesterday evening. Cassandra pressed against his side, both of them laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. Standard security protocol, Sloane explained, her voice clinical. We record all guest interactions for safety purposes. But the footage didn't stop with the check-in. Julian watched in growing horror as it switched to hallway cameras, showing him and Cassandra stumbling toward the presidential suite, hands roaming, mouths locked together in desperate kisses. The timestamp showed 9:47 p.m., less than 3 hours after he'd texted Sloane that he loved her. The presidential suite has enhanced security features, Sloane continued, her tone never wavering from professional courtesy. Motion sensors, audio recording capabilities, thermal imaging. All standard for our highest tier accommodations. Julian's stomach dropped into free fall. You recorded us? I recorded you committing adultery in my hotel, yes. She swiped to another screen. Would you like to hear the audio? You were quite passionate about how much more exciting Cassandra is than your boring housewife. Beside him, Cassandra made a sound like a wounded animal. Julian couldn't look at her, couldn't bear to see the reflection of his own devastation in her eyes. That's illegal, he whispered. Recording private conversations without consent. Actually, Sloane interrupted, and her smile was sharp as a scalpel. Guests consent to all security monitoring when they sign the registration. It's in the fine print. Page 3, paragraph 7. You signed it yourself. She pulled out another document. The hotel registration Julian had filled out in his eagerness to get Cassandra upstairs. His own signature stared back at him, right below text that clearly outlined the hotel's comprehensive recording policies. The beautiful thing about being thorough, Sloane said, is that everything is legal. Everything is documented. Everything is ironclad. But the worst was yet to come. The tablet screen shifted again, showing a different location. Not the hotel, but somewhere Julian recognized with sick familiarity. His law office. The same conference room where he and Cassandra had first crossed the line from professional to personal. 6 months of footage, Sloane said softly. From cameras you didn't know existed, installed by a security company I own. Every lunch meeting that ran long. Every working dinner that ended with you fucking my husband's mistress on the same table where you negotiate contracts. Julian's vision grayed at the edges. That's impossible. I would have seen cameras. Modern surveillance technology is remarkably sophisticated, Sloane explained, particularly when installed by professionals who know what they're doing. The footage was damning. Months of secret meetings, stolen kisses, passionate encounters in rooms Julian had thought were private. Worse, the audio was crystal clear. His voice, telling Cassandra how unhappy he was in his marriage. How Sloane didn't understand him. How he deserved better than a wife who was too boring to appreciate him. This is entrapment. Cassandra finally found her voice, though it came out as a rasp. You can't manipulate people like this. Like what? Sloane's eyebrows rose in innocent surprise. Like providing excellent security for my business properties? Like ensuring my law firm tenants feel safe in their workplace? Like protecting my investments? The trap was more elegant than Julian had imagined. Everything she'd done was legal, justifiable, completely above board. She hadn't manipulated them into the affair. She'd simply documented it with the thoroughness of someone who understood that information was power. My law firm, Julian said numbly. You said my law firm. Jennings and Associates has been behind on rent for 18 months, Sloane confirmed. 3 months ago, when you were facing eviction, a holding company owned by Armand Hospitality Group purchased your building. Your lease was extended, your rent reduced by 40%. I've been subsidizing your business, Julian, while you've been using it as a base of operations for your affair. The office walls seemed to close in around him. Every breath felt like drowning. Why? Because I needed time, Sloane said simply. Time to document everything. Time to ensure that when this moment came, you would have no legal recourse, no way to claim victimization, no option except complete surrender. She stood, moving around the desk with predatory grace. Do you know what the hardest part was, Julian? Not the investigation, not the surveillance, not even discovering that my husband was stealing from me to fund his midlife crisis. She stopped directly in front of his chair, forcing him to look up at her. The hardest part was pretending to be the woman you wanted me to be. The quiet, boring housewife who didn't ask too many questions. The trusting wife who believed your stories about working late. The supportive partner who never demanded to know where our money was really going. Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow seemed louder than screaming. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to pretend to be smaller than you are? To hide your intelligence, your success, your entire identity, because your husband needs to feel superior to the woman he married. Julian felt something breaking inside his chest. Sloane, I never asked you to. You didn't have to ask. Her laugh was bitter as winter wind. You made it clear every day. Every time you explained something I already knew. Every time you made decisions about our life without consulting me. Every time you acted like my opinions were cute suggestions from someone who didn't understand the real world. She returned to her desk, but the distance felt like a chasm now. I spent 8 years being the woman you wanted. Quiet, supportive, grateful for your protection and guidance. And this is how you repaid me, by deciding I wasn't worth being faithful to. The words hit Julian like physical blows. Because underneath the anger and betrayal, he could hear something else in her voice, genuine hurt. The pain of a woman who'd made herself smaller to fit into his world, only to discover that even that sacrifice hadn't been enough. I loved you, he said, and the words felt like broken glass in his throat. No, Sloane said firmly. You loved the idea of me. The version of me that made you feel important and needed and superior. You never bothered to love the real me, because you never bothered to find out who that was. She pulled out another folder, and Julian braced himself for more revelations. Cassandra Vale, she read from the top document. Married to Robert Vale, CEO of Vale Construction. 3 children, Emma, age 12, Michael, age 10, and Sophia, age 7. Interesting family, by the way. I had lunch with Robert last week. Cassandra went white as snow. You didn't? Oh, I did. Lovely man. Very devoted to his family. We discussed several potential construction projects for future Armand properties. He was quite proud when he mentioned his wife's humanitarian work. Apparently you've been volunteering with a literacy program in South America. The blood drained from Cassandra's face. That's confidential. Is it? Sloane's smile was innocent as poison. Because according to my records, you've never left the country in the past 2 years. Those humanitarian trips you've been telling your husband about? They were actually long weekends with Julian at various hotels. She slid a stack of travel records across the desk. Credit card statements, hotel reservations, airline tickets, all showing Cassandra's real whereabouts during her supposed charity work. Robert was particularly interested when I mentioned that our hotel occasionally hosts corporate retreats for legal firms. He's thinking of recommending our services to his company's legal department. Small world, isn't it? The threat was clear. Robert Vale would eventually discover that his wife's charity work coincided perfectly with Julian's law firm's business conferences. "You're going to destroy both our marriages," Cassandra whispered. "I'm going to destroy one marriage," Sloane corrected. "Mine. It's already over. Has been since the moment Julian decided I wasn't enough for him. The question is whether yours survives what comes next." She turned back to Julian, and for a moment the mask slipped. He saw the woman he'd fallen in love with at that charity gala, brilliant, passionate, heartbreakingly beautiful. But now he understood that she'd been hiding all that light under a bushel for 8 years, dimming herself so he could shine brighter. "This is your choice, Julian. Sign the papers, accept the divorce settlement, and walk away quietly. Cassandra goes back to her family, you get a chance to rebuild your life, and everyone moves forward with minimal damage." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Or refuse to sign, fight me in court, and I release everything. The surveillance footage, the financial records, the evidence of systematic theft from our joint accounts. I'll make sure it all becomes public record in the most humiliating way possible." Julian stared at the papers, understanding finally that this had never been about revenge. It was about justice. Sloane hadn't destroyed his life. She'd simply revealed the destruction he'd been causing all along. "The woman I married," he said slowly, "she never existed, did she?" Sloane's expression softened for just a moment. "She existed, Julian. But you never bothered to meet her. You were too busy falling in love with the performance I gave you." The pen felt impossibly heavy in his hand. Around him, the office was silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic far below. His entire life balanced on the tip of a ballpoint pen, and for the first time in months, Julian Jennings faced a choice where all the options led to consequences he couldn't escape. Behind him, Cassandra was crying, soft, broken sounds that reminded him of all the tears his wife had probably shed in private while maintaining her perfect facade. And in front of him, Sloane Armand Jennings waited with the patience of someone who held all the power and could afford to be generous with time. Because they both knew that no matter what he chose, she had already won. The only question now was how much damage he wanted to cause on his way to accepting defeat. Julian stared at the pen in his trembling hand, the weight of it somehow heavier than the entire 22 floors beneath them. In the silence of Sloane's office, he could hear everything. The soft hum of the air conditioning, the distant traffic far below, Cassandra's ragged breathing beside him, and underneath it all, the thundering of his own pulse as his life balanced on the tip of a ballpoint pen. "You need more time to think?" Sloane's voice was perfectly calm, almost gentle. The tone of someone who could afford infinite patience because they held all the power. "This is insane," Cassandra suddenly exploded, her composure finally cracking completely. "You can't just destroy people's lives like this. Julian, don't sign anything. This is manipulation, coercion." "Is it?" Sloane interrupted, her eyebrows rising in mock surprise. "Julian came to my hotel with you voluntarily. He registered under our married name voluntarily. He stole from our joint accounts voluntarily. Which part of this is coercion, exactly?" Julian felt something dying inside his chest as the full scope of his situation crystallized. Every choice he'd made, every lie, every secret meeting, every stolen moment with Cassandra, had been documented with the thoroughness of someone who understood that information was the ultimate weapon. "I want to call my lawyer," he said weakly. Sloane's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Your lawyer? Do you mean Harrison Burke from Burke & Associates? Lovely man. We had lunch yesterday to discuss Armand Hospitality Group's legal needs. Quite the extensive conversation about conflict of interest policies." Julian's stomach dropped into free fall. Harry Burke had been his mentor, his friend, the man who'd taught him everything about corporate law. If Sloane had gotten to him, "You can't practice law and be married to someone in your client base," Sloane continued conversationally. "Professional ethics, you understand. Harry was very concerned when I mentioned that my husband might need separate representation for our divorce proceedings." The trap was total, Julian realized. Not just legal or financial, but professional. His career, his reputation, his entire life, all of it hung by threads that Sloane controlled. "What do you want from me?" The words came out as a whisper. "I want you to understand," Sloane said, and for the first time since this nightmare began, her voice carried real emotion. I want you to feel what I felt when I realized that the man I'd loved for 8 years saw me as so insignificant that he could steal from me, lie to me, and betray me without ever worrying that I might be intelligent enough to figure it out. She stood, moving to the wall where those photographs hung. Images of a successful businesswoman Julian had never bothered to know existed. Do you see this picture? She pointed to a photo of herself cutting a ribbon at some grand opening, surrounded by city officials and business leaders. This was taken 3 years ago, the opening of our flagship property downtown. I gave the keynote speech to 400 people that night. Julian stared at the photo, trying to reconcile the confident woman in the image with the wife who claimed she wasn't good at public speaking. I came home that night, Sloane continued, excited to share the biggest success of my career with my husband. Do you remember what you did, Julian? The memory hit him like a physical blow. 3 years ago, Sloane had come home late from what she'd claimed was a volunteer meeting, glowing with some kind of excitement. She tried to tell him about her evening, but he'd been reviewing briefs for a case, barely listening. You told me you were glad my little volunteer work made me happy, Sloane said softly. Then you asked me to keep it down because you had real work to do. The words echoed in the sterile office air like accusations. Julian felt something breaking apart inside his chest, not just guilt, but the terrible recognition of a truth he'd been avoiding for years. I made myself small for you, Sloane continued, turning back to face him. I hid my success, downplayed my achievements, pretended to be the quiet little wife who needed your guidance and protection. Because somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that was what love looked like. Making yourself smaller so your partner could feel bigger. Cassandra had gone very quiet beside him, and Julian wondered if she was recognizing her own marriage in Sloane's words. But the thing about making yourself smaller, Sloane said, is that eventually people start to see you as actually being small. You stopped seeing me as an equal, Julian. I became your domestic accessory. Someone whose opinions you could dismiss, whose feelings you could ignore, whose trust you could betray without consequence. She returned to her desk, but instead of sitting, she leaned against it, her posture casual despite the devastating words. So when I discovered your affair, I had a choice. I could confront you immediately, demand explanations, fight for a marriage that you'd already abandoned. Or I could finally stop making myself small and show you exactly who you'd been married to all along. Julian's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen. Sloane, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Are you? Her question was sharp as a blade. Are you sorry you had an affair, or are you sorry you got caught? Are you sorry you stole from our accounts, or are you sorry I found out? Are you sorry you dismissed and ignored me for years, or are you just sorry that it turned out I was paying attention? The questions hung in the air like bullets, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. I loved you, Julian said desperately. No, Sloane replied with devastating certainty. You loved the idea of me. The version I performed for you because I thought that's what marriage required. You never loved the real me, Julian, because you never bothered to find out who that was. Cassandra suddenly stood, her chair scraping against the marble floor. This is sick. This whole thing is sick. Julian, she's been spying on us for months, manipulating us, setting us up. Setting you up? Sloane's laugh was bitter. I provided you with hotel rooms for your affair. I made sure Julian's law firm stayed afloat, so he could afford to wine and dine you. I even had my staff send you anniversary flowers last month. Do you remember those, Cassandra? The ones Julian took credit for. Cassandra's face went white. Julian remembered the flowers. Roses that had arrived at Cassandra's office with a card he hadn't written but had been too proud to correct when she thanked him. Everything you've enjoyed about your affair, Sloane continued relentlessly, has been funded and facilitated by me. I've been subsidizing my own betrayal for 6 months. So tell me again how I'm the one manipulating people. The office fell into a silence so complete Julian could hear his own heartbeat. Outside the windows, the city sprawled in all directions. Millions of people living their lives, making their choices, facing their consequences. And here, 22 floors above it all, Julian Jennings was finally being forced to confront the man he'd become. Sign the papers, Cassandra said suddenly, her voice flat. Julian, just sign them. He turned to stare at her, shocked by the betrayal in her voice. This isn't worth it, she continued, avoiding his eyes. She's right. We got caught. It's over. Just sign the papers and let's end this. Let's end this. As if their 6-month affair was some inconvenient business deal that had gone south. as if the destruction of his marriage was just a minor setback in her carefully managed life. "Cassandra, I'm going back to my husband," she said firmly. "I'm going to tell Robert everything, ask for his forgiveness, and try to save my marriage. You should do the same with yours." She looked at Sloane with something that might have been respect. "Though I suppose it's too late for that." Julian felt the last pillar of his delusion crumble. Cassandra, the woman he'd risked everything for, the woman who'd made him feel alive and desired and important, was abandoning him the moment things became difficult. Just like he'd abandoned Sloane the moment his marriage required real effort instead of comfortable routine. "She doesn't love you, Julian," Sloane said quietly. "She never did. You were just an escape from a marriage she was too cowardly to fix or leave honestly." The words hit like physical blows, but Julian couldn't deny their truth. In this office, surrounded by evidence of his wife's hidden strength and success, facing the reality of his mistress's shallow affection, he finally saw himself clearly. He was a weak man who'd confused control for love, dismissal for protection, and betrayal for passion. He'd thrown away 8 years with an extraordinary woman because he'd been too small to see her greatness. The pen felt impossibly heavy in his hand as he lowered it toward the signature line. "Wait," Sloane said, and Julian's head snapped up, hope flaring in his chest like struck match. "There's one more thing you need to know." She pressed a button on her desk, and a large screen descended from the ceiling, displaying what looked like a legal document. "Your law firm," she said simply. "Jennings and Associates." Julian stared at the document, his legal training automatically parsing the complex language. Purchase agreement. Asset transfer. New ownership structure. "As of yesterday afternoon," Sloane continued, "Jennings and Associates is wholly owned by Armand Hospitality Group. Congratulations, Julian. You now work for your wife." The room spun around him. His law firm, the one thing he'd built himself, his professional identity, his legacy, now belonged to the woman he'd betrayed. "Of course," Sloane added conversationally, "employee contracts can be terminated at any time for cause. Theft, for instance, or conduct detrimental to company reputation." Julian's vision grayed at the edges. She owned everything. His marriage, his career, his financial future, his reputation. With a word, she could destroy not just his life, but his ability to rebuild it anywhere else. "So you see," Sloane said softly, "you don't just work for me now, Julian. You are me. Everything you thought you owned, everything you thought you'd built, everything you thought made you independent, it's all mine. It always was." The pen slipped from Julian's nerveless fingers, clattering onto the marble floor like the sound of his world ending. And in the terrible silence that followed, Julian Jennings finally understood that he wasn't just signing divorce papers. He was signing his complete and total surrender to a woman he'd spent 8 years underestimating. A woman who'd just proven that the only thing more dangerous than being her enemy was having been foolish enough to think she was weak. The pen lay on the marble floor between them like a fallen sword, and Julian stared at it as if it held the power to resurrect the dead. Which, in a way, it did. Because the man he'd been for the past 8 years, the man who'd thought he was protecting and providing for his quiet little wife, was as dead as if Sloane had put a bullet through his heart. "Pick it up," Cassandra said, her voice sharp with panic. "Julian, just pick up the pen and sign the papers. End this." But Julian couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process the magnitude of what Sloane had just revealed. She owned his law firm. She owned his professional life. She owned everything he'd thought made him a man worth respecting. "I need a moment," he whispered. "You've had 8 years of moments," Sloane replied, but her voice had lost some of its sharp edge. For the first time since this nightmare began, she sounded tired. "Human. 8 years to see me, Julian. 8 years to ask me about my day, and actually listen to the answer. 8 years to wonder why I never seemed to need money despite having no apparent income." She moved around her desk, and Julian was startled when she knelt to pick up the pen herself. When she handed it back to him, their fingers brushed, and the contact sent electricity shooting up his arm. "Do you want to know the worst part?" Sloane asked, settling into the chair across from him instead of behind her imposing desk. The change in positioning felt significant. Less like a business negotiation, more like a conversation between two people who'd once shared a bed and dreams and 8 years of breakfasts together. Julian nodded, not trusting his voice. "The worst part was how much I wanted you to ask. Every night when you came home and I tried to tell you about my day, I was hoping, praying, that you'd hear something in my voice that made you curious. That you'd wonder why I was so excited about volunteer work, or why I had to take so many business calls for charity events. She leaned forward, and Julian could smell her perfume. The same scent she'd worn on their wedding day, the same scent that had been on his pillow every morning for 8 years. I wanted you to be curious about me, Julian. I wanted you to want to know who I really was. Instead, you seemed relieved that I was so low maintenance. So easy to dismiss. The words hit him like physical blows because they were undeniably true. How many times had he congratulated himself on having a wife who didn't nag, who didn't demand his attention, who seemed content with whatever scraps of himself he was willing to share. I was working 70-hour weeks, he said weakly. Building the firm, trying to provide for us. With my money, Sloane interrupted, but gently. Julian, you've been building your firm with loans from Armand Holdings for 3 years. Every major client you've landed came through referrals I arranged. Every case you've won was supported by research my staff provided. You haven't been providing for me. I've been providing for you. The revelation hit him like ice water. His success, his reputation, his professional achievements. How much of it had been real, and how much had been Sloane quietly pulling strings behind the scenes? Why? The question came out as a croak. If you were this successful, this powerful, why did you need me at all? For the first time, Sloane's composed mask slipped completely. Julian saw pain flash across her features. Raw, honest, devastating pain. Because I loved you, she said simply. Because when I met you at that charity gala, you looked at me like I was the most fascinating woman in the world. You asked me questions about my work, my opinions, my dreams. You made me feel like I was worth getting to know. She stood abruptly, moving back to the window that overlooked the city. But somewhere between our wedding and our first anniversary, that stopped. I became furniture in our house. Background noise in your life. And I convinced myself that if I just tried harder, became easier to love, made fewer demands on your time and attention, you'd see me again. Julian felt tears burning behind his eyes. Sloane, I made myself invisible, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. And you let me. You were so comfortable with having a wife who didn't challenge you, who didn't compete with you, who didn't require you to be better than you were. The silence stretched between them, filled with 8 years of missed opportunities and misunderstood love. Cassandra shifted uncomfortably in her chair. This is very touching, she said, her voice dripping sarcasm. But some of us have families to get back to. Julian, sign the papers so we can leave. Both Julian and Sloane turned to look at her, and Julian saw something in his wife's expression that made his blood run cold. Not anger, calculation. Actually, Cassandra, Sloane said conversationally, I don't think you'll be going anywhere for a while. She pressed another button on her desk, and the office door opened to reveal 2 men in expensive suits. Not hotel security, something more serious, more professional. Mrs. Vale, the taller man said, stepping into the room. I'm Detective Morrison, Financial Crimes Division. We need to speak with you about some irregularities in your husband's construction accounts. Cassandra went white as snow. I don't know what you're talking about. The Vale construction account that's been funding your hotel stays with Mr. Jennings, Detective Morrison continued, consulting a tablet. The corporate credit card charges at restaurants and jewelry stores. The cash withdrawals that coincide with your romantic getaways. Julian watched in horror as Cassandra's world collapsed with the same systematic precision Sloane had used to dismantle his own. Your husband reported the unauthorized charges this morning, the detective continued, along with evidence that you've been forging his signature on company checks for the past 6 months. That's impossible, Cassandra gasped. Robert doesn't know, he can't know. About the affair? No, he doesn't. Yet. Sloane's smile was sharp as winter wind. But he does know about the embezzlement. I had coffee with him this morning, showed him some concerning financial irregularities I'd noticed in the hotel charges. He was quite grateful for the heads up. The trap was complete, Julian realized with sick fascination. Sloane hadn't just orchestrated his downfall. She'd maneuvered Cassandra into destroying herself. You can't do this, Cassandra said, but her voice lacked conviction. I didn't do anything, Sloane replied calmly. You stole from your husband to fund your affair. I simply made sure he found out about it in the most legally advantageous way possible. Detective Morrison stepped forward. Mrs. Vale, you'll need to come with us. As they led Cassandra toward the door, she turned back to Julian with desperation written across her face. Julian, don't let them do this to me. Tell them it wasn't my idea. But Julian couldn't speak, couldn't move, Couldn't do anything except watch the woman he'd risked everything for get arrested for crimes he'd helped her commit. The door closed behind them with a soft click, leaving Julian alone with his wife for the first time in months. "She never loved you," Sloane said quietly. "You know that now, don't you?" Julian nodded numbly. The evidence was overwhelming. Cassandra's willingness to abandon him the moment things got difficult, her immediate attempt to throw him under the bus when faced with consequences. "She was using you the same way you were using me," Sloane continued, taking what she needed without giving anything real in return. Julian looked up at his wife, really looked at her for the first time in years. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that. She was powerful, intelligent, successful in ways he'd never imagined. And he'd thrown it all away for someone who disappeared the moment their fantasy collided with reality. "I don't know how to fix this," he said, his voice breaking. "You can't," Sloane replied, but her tone wasn't cruel. Just honest. "What we had is broken beyond repair, Julian. You can't uncheat on someone. You can't unsteal from your marriage. You can't undismiss 8 years of trying to be seen by the person who's supposed to love you most." She returned to her desk, pulling out a different set of papers. "But you can choose how this ends." Julian stared at the new documents, his legal training automatically parsing the language. Not just divorce papers, a complete dissolution of their shared life, but with terms far more generous than he deserved. "You keep the house," Sloane said. "The car, your personal belongings, a settlement that will let you start over somewhere else. Your law firm, well, that's more complicated." She leaned back in her chair, studying him with those intelligent eyes he'd somehow forgotten were the reason he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. "I own your firm now, yes. But I'm not interested in running a law practice. So you have 2 choices." Julian held his breath. "Choice 1. I sell the firm to the highest bidder. Your name comes off the door, your clients get reassigned, and you walk away with whatever money is left after debts are settled. You're free to start over wherever you want, but you start with nothing." The first option felt like death, professional obliteration, the complete erasure of everything he'd built. "Choice 2, he managed to ask. Sloane's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Choice 2, you earn it back." Julian's head snapped up. "You work for me," she continued, "as an employee of Armand Holdings, handling legal work for my properties. You prove that you can be trusted, that you can be honest, that you can be the man I thought I married 8 years ago. And eventually, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10, you buy back your firm at fair market value." It was a lifeline, Julian realized. Not forgiveness, but the possibility of redemption. "Why?" he asked. "After everything I've done, why would you give me that chance?" Sloane was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her desk as she considered the question. "Because despite everything you've done to me," she said finally, "I still remember the man who asked me to dance at that charity gala. The man who listened to my dreams and made me believe they mattered. That man is still in there somewhere, Julian. Buried under years of selfishness and entitlement and willful blindness, but still there." She stood, moving around the desk one final time. "The question is, do you want to find him again? Or do you want to keep being the man who threw away 8 years of marriage for 6 months of meaningless sex?" Julian stared at the papers, both sets. The easy exit and the hard redemption. The choice between starting over with nothing and earning back everything he'd lost. It was, he realized, the first real choice he'd made in years. Not a choice between comfort and excitement, or between his wife and his mistress, but a choice between the man he'd become and the man he could still be. The pen felt different in his hand this time. Not heavy with the weight of defeat, but balanced with possibility. Around him, the office was silent except for the soft sound of his own breathing and the distant hum of the city below. Through the windows, afternoon sunlight slanted across the marble floors, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like possibilities made visible. Sloane waited with the patience of someone who'd already won everything that mattered. The question now wasn't whether she would destroy him. She'd already proven she could do that with surgical precision. The question was whether Julian Jennings had the courage to destroy himself. To kill the weak, selfish man he'd become and see if anything worth salvaging remained underneath. Julian stared at the 2 sets of documents spread before him like tarot cards revealing alternate futures. The afternoon sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across the marble floor, and in those shadows he could see the ghost of every choice that had brought him to this moment. The pen trembled in his hand, suspended between 2 signatures that would determine not just what happened next, but who he would become. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I need you to tell me the truth." Sloane nodded, settling back in her chair with the patience of someone who'd spent months orchestrating this exact moment. "At the charity gala, 8 years ago, when we first met," Julian's throat felt like sandpaper. "Did you know who I was? Did you plan that too?" For the first time since this nightmare began, Sloane looked genuinely surprised. "Plan what? Meeting me? Marrying me? All of this?" Julian gestured around the office, encompassing the photographs of her success, the evidence of her power, the elaborate revenge that had destroyed his life with surgical precision. "Was I just another acquisition for your empire?" Sloane was quiet for so long that Julian began to wonder if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability he hadn't heard since their wedding day. "Julian, do you remember what you were wearing that night?" The question caught him off guard. "What? At the gala? What were you wearing?" Julian frowned, trying to recall details from 8 years ago. "A tuxedo. Black tie event." "You were wearing your father's cufflinks," Sloane said softly. "The ones with your family crest. They were too big for your wrists, and you kept tugging at them nervously." The memory hit him like a physical blow. He'd forgotten about those cufflinks, his father's only inheritance, worn that night because he'd wanted to feel connected to something bigger than himself. "You told me they belonged to your father," Sloane continued. "That he died when you were in law school, and wearing them made you feel like he was proud of you." Julian's vision blurred. He had told her that, during their first dance. A moment of unexpected vulnerability from a man who'd spent years learning to keep his emotions locked away. "You asked me if I thought he would have liked you," Sloane said, and now there were tears in her eyes too. This brilliant, successful attorney, asking a woman he'd just met if his dead father would approve of me. "And I realized that underneath all your confidence and ambition, you were just as afraid of not being enough as I was." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning 8 years of misunderstanding. "I didn't plan any of it, Julian. I fell in love with you that night because you let me see past your armor. Because you trusted me with something real and vulnerable and true." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so familiar it made Julian's chest ache. "The tragedy isn't that you married me for my money," she continued. "It's that you never realized you didn't need to. I would have loved you if you'd been a struggling public defender living in a studio apartment. I would have supported your dreams if you'd trusted me enough to share them honestly." Julian felt something breaking apart inside his chest. Not shattering like his illusions had been doing all day, but cracking open like an egg to reveal something fragile and new underneath. "Instead," Sloane said, "you spent 8 years trying to be worthy of a woman who was already yours. And in the process, you became someone I couldn't recognize." The truth of it hit Julian like a lightning strike. All his lies, all his deceptions, all his attempts to appear successful and in control, they'd been motivated by the same fear that had made him tug nervously at his father's cufflinks. The fear of not being enough. "I was afraid," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "Afraid that if you knew how much the firm was struggling, how much I was failing, you'd realize you'd married the wrong man. So you stole from me instead," Sloane said, but her voice held understanding rather than condemnation. "You lied to me instead. You betrayed me instead. Because somehow that felt safer than being honest." Julian nodded, unable to speak past the tears clogging his throat. "And Cassandra?" Sloane's voice was gentle, but the question cut deep. "What was she?" Julian closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to see his affair for what it really was. "She was proof. Proof that I could still be the man I was before everything started falling apart. She made me feel powerful, important, like I was worth wanting. The way I used to make you feel. The way you still could have," Julian said, opening his eyes to meet her gaze. "If I'd been brave enough to let you." For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the debris of their marriage. Julian saw himself reflected in Sloane's eyes, not the confident attorney he'd pretended to be, or the weak man who'd betrayed her trust, but something in between. Something human and flawed and real. "There's something else you need to know," Sloane said, reaching into her desk drawer. Julian braced himself for another revelation, another twist in this elaborate game of chess she'd been playing. Instead, she pulled out a small velvet box. "I bought this 6 months ago," she said, opening it to reveal a pair of cufflinks, elegant, masculine, perfectly sized. "For our anniversary. I had them engraved." She handed him the box, and Julian read the inscription with growing amazement. To the man who taught me to dance. S. I knew about your affair, Sloane continued. I knew you were stealing from our accounts. I knew your firm was failing. And I still bought these, because I remembered the man who'd trusted me with his father's memory on our first night together. Julian stared at the cufflinks, understanding flooding through him like warm water. You were trying to save us. I was trying to save you, Sloane corrected. From the lies, from the fear, from the man you were becoming. I thought if I could show you that you were already enough, that you'd always been enough, maybe we could find our way back to each other. The gift made her revenge even more devastating, Julian realized. She'd been planning to give him proof of her love at the exact moment she was documenting his betrayal. But then you brought her here, Sloane said, her voice hardening. To my hotel, using our anniversary as your cover story. And I realized that saving you might require destroying the man you'd become first. Julian set down the cufflinks with hands that shook like leaves in a storm. Everything he'd thought he understood about this day, about Sloane's motivation, about the elaborate trap she'd set, it was all wrong. This wasn't revenge. This was surgery. She'd systematically cut away everything false and weak and selfish in his life, leaving him with nothing but the choice of who he wanted to be when the healing was done. The man at that charity gala, Julian said slowly. The one who trusted you with his fears and asked you to dance. Is he still worth saving? Sloane's smile was soft as sunrise. I don't know, Julian. Is he? The question hung in the air like a challenge, like a prayer, like the last test in an examination that had been 8 years in the making. Julian picked up the pen one final time, feeling its weight not as a burden but as a tool. An instrument of creation rather than destruction. The easy path lay before him. Sign the divorce papers, take the settlement, disappear into a new life where no one knew about his failures or his betrayals. Start over with a clean slate and the hard-won wisdom of a man who'd lost everything once. The hard path was more complex. Years of earning back trust, of proving himself worthy of the love he'd thrown away, of becoming the man he'd glimpsed in Sloane's eyes that first night they'd danced together. Both paths led away from the weak, frightened man who'd checked into this hotel yesterday with another woman on his arm. The question was which direction would take him closer to the man he was meant to be. Julian looked up at his wife, brilliant, powerful, heartbreakingly beautiful Sloane Armand Jennings, and saw not his judge or his destroyer, but his mirror. A reflection of what love looked like when it was brave enough to demand better. I want to earn it back, he said, his voice steady for the first time all day. All of it. Your trust, your respect, the right to say I love you and have it mean something real. He signed his name to the employment contract with firm, decisive strokes. Not Julian Jennings, successful attorney and faithless husband, but simply Julian, a man who'd finally run out of lies and discovered that the truth, however terrifying, was the only foundation strong enough to build a real life on. It won't be easy, Sloane warned, but her eyes held something Julian hadn't seen in years. Hope. Good, Julian replied, setting down the pen with the finality of a man who'd just chosen to save his own life. Easy is what got us here in the first place. Outside the windows, the city sparkled in the late afternoon sun, full of people making choices and living with consequences and finding ways to love each other despite their flaws. And 22 floors above it all, in an office where truth had finally triumphed over lies, two people who'd forgotten how to see each other began the long, difficult, beautiful work of remembering how to love. 6 months later, Julian Jennings arrived at the Armand Holdings corporate headquarters at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes earlier than required, and carrying 2 cups of coffee from the lobby cafe. The building's marble floors reflected the early morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and somewhere in that reflection, he caught glimpses of a man he was still learning to recognize. The elevator climbed silently to the 22nd floor, and Julian used those precious moments to center himself the way his therapist had taught him. Deep breath in. Acknowledge the fear. Deep breath out. Choose courage anyway. The executive assistant's desk outside Sloane's office was empty. Maria wouldn't arrive for another hour, but Julian could see light spilling from beneath the frosted glass doors. Sloane was already at work, of course. He'd learned over the past 6 months that his wife had always been an early riser, one of the countless details about her life he'd never bothered to notice during their marriage. He knocked softly and waited for permission before entering. "Good morning, Mrs. Jennings," he said, setting one of the coffee cups on her desk. "Your usual. Extra shot, oat milk, no sugar." Sloane looked up from the contracts she'd been reviewing, and Julian felt that familiar flutter in his chest. The same one he'd experienced at their first meeting 8 years ago. She was beautiful in the morning light, but more than that, she was formidable. Intelligent. Present in a way that made every interaction feel significant. "Thank you, Julian," she said, accepting the coffee with a small smile. "The Morrison contract? Reviewed and ready for your signature," Julian replied, placing a manila folder beside her coffee. "I've flagged 3 clauses that need revision, sections 12, 18, and 23. The liability language is too broad, and the termination conditions favor their side heavily." Sloane opened the folder, scanning his notes with the same attention to detail she brought to everything. Julian had learned to appreciate that thoroughness over the past months, the way she considered every angle before making decisions. It was one of the qualities that had made her such a successful businesswoman, and one of the reasons their marriage had failed. He'd never given her the space to apply that intelligence to their relationship. "Excellent work," she said after reviewing his analysis. "Draft the revisions and send them to Morrison's team by noon." "Already done," Julian said, producing another folder. "I took the liberty of preparing 3 alternative approaches, depending on how aggressive you want to be in negotiations." Something flickered in Sloane's expression, approval maybe or surprise. Even after 6 months of working together, she sometimes seemed amazed by his competence. It had taken Julian time to realize this wasn't because she thought he was incompetent, but because the man she'd been married to had hidden his capabilities behind layers of insecurity and deception. "How are you feeling about the Riverside project?" she asked, settling back in her chair with her coffee. Julian considered the question carefully. The Riverside Hotel was his first major solo assignment, a troubled property that Armand Holdings was considering for acquisition. The old Julian would have inflated his confidence, claimed everything was under control, whether it was or not. The new Julian had learned the radical concept of honesty. "Cautiously optimistic," he said. "The structural issues are more extensive than the initial survey indicated, which will add roughly $2 million to the renovation costs. But the location is exceptional, and my financial projections show strong profit potential even with the increased investment." Concerns. The zoning board meeting next week. Councilman Bradley has been asking pointed questions about our environmental impact assessments. I think he's fishing for reasons to oppose the project. Sloane nodded thoughtfully. Bradley's facing re-election next year. His opponent has been critical of development projects in that district. She made a note on her tablet. Set up a meeting with the environmental consultants. If our assessments are solid, we go public with them before the zoning hearing. If there are weaknesses, better to address them proactively. Julian marveled at how her mind worked. Always 3 steps ahead, always considering angles he hadn't thought of. During their marriage, he dismissed her careful approach to decision-making as indecisiveness. Now he recognized it as strategic intelligence. "I'll handle it," he said. "I know you will." The simple statement carried weight that would have been impossible 6 months ago. Trust, earned through consistent competence and radical honesty. Their working relationship had developed its own rhythm over the past months. Professional conversations that occasionally drifted into something more personal. Shared late nights when major deals demanded attention. Moments of collaboration that reminded them both why they'd fallen in love in the first place. But underneath the professional courtesy lay more complicated territory. The wreckage of their marriage, the slow work of rebuilding trust, and the question neither of them had been brave enough to address directly. What happened next? "Julian," Sloane said, and something in her tone made him look up from his notes. "I have something for you." She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a familiar manila envelope. Julian's stomach clenched as he recognized the legal documents inside. The ones that would finalize their divorce, officially ending 8 years of marriage and 6 months of this strange professional purgatory. "The waiting period ends today," Sloane said softly. "If you sign these, we'll be officially divorced by the end of the week." Julian stared at the envelope, understanding that this was another choice point, another moment where his future would be determined by his courage or cowardice. "And if I don't sign them? Then we're still married," Sloane said simply. "Still trying to figure out if 2 people who've hurt each other as badly as we have can find their way back to something real." The office fell quiet except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of the city, waking up 22 floors below. Julian thought about the past 6 months. The therapy sessions where he'd learned to recognize his patterns of self-deception, The long nights when he'd faced the full scope of his failures, the gradual process of becoming someone worthy of the love he'd thrown away. "I signed divorce papers once before," he said. "6 months ago in this office. Do you remember what you told me?" Sloane's smile was soft as morning light. "That you could choose how it ended. I chose badly then. I chose the coward's path, sign the papers, take the settlement, disappear into a new life where I didn't have to face what I'd done." Julian stood, moving to the window that overlooked the city. Somewhere out there, people were making choices about love and commitment and forgiveness. Choosing to fight for relationships worth saving or walking away from ones that couldn't be healed. "But you didn't let me," he continued. "You offered me something harder. The chance to earn back what I'd lost." He turned back to face her, this brilliant woman who'd saved him from himself. "I'm not the same man who walked into this hotel 6 months ago. I'm not the man who lied to you for years, who stole from you, who betrayed you with someone else. That man was weak and scared and so desperate to feel important that he destroyed everything good in his life." Sloane watched him with those intelligent eyes, waiting. "But I'm also not the man I was before we got married. I can't go back to being the person who fell in love with you at that charity gala, because that man didn't know how to sustain love through difficulty. He didn't know how to be vulnerable without being weak, or how to be strong without being controlling." Julian moved closer to her desk, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "I'm someone new," he said. "Someone who's learned that love isn't about being worthy of another person. It's about choosing to be worthy of yourself. Someone who understands that marriage isn't about finding someone who completes you, but about becoming someone worthy of partnership with another complete person." He reached across the desk, covering her hand with his. "I don't want to sign those papers, Sloane. Not because I'm afraid of being alone, but because I finally understand what I'd be walking away from. Not just you, but the possibility of us. The real us, built on truth instead of lies, on seeing instead of assuming, on choosing each other every day instead of taking each other for granted." Sloane's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Julian, I know I don't deserve another chance," he continued. "I know that forgiveness isn't something you can earn back with 6 months of good behavior. I know that love isn't enough if it's built on a foundation of betrayal." He squeezed her hand gently. "But I also know that we're both different people than we were 6 months ago. You've stopped hiding your strength, and I've stopped hiding my weakness. Maybe that's enough to start over. Not as the people we were, but as the people we're becoming." For a long moment, Sloane was quiet. Then she reached for the envelope with her free hand. Julian's heart stopped as she opened it, pulling out the divorce papers that would end their marriage forever. Instead of signing them, she tore them in half. "I called my lawyer yesterday," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Had her draw up new papers. Different papers." She reached into another drawer, pulling out a document that made Julian's breath catch in his throat. A marriage certificate. Not divorce papers, but a renewal of vows. 8 years ago, 2 people who barely knew each other promised to love and honor and cherish until death do them part, Sloane said. They meant it, but they didn't understand what it would cost. They didn't know that love isn't a feeling you fall into, but a choice you make every day. They didn't know that honoring someone means seeing them clearly, even when what you see challenges everything you thought you knew about yourself. She stood, moving around the desk to face him directly. "I don't want to be married to the man I married 8 years ago," she said. "But I would very much like to be married to the man you're becoming." Julian felt tears burning behind his eyes as understanding flooded through him. "A fresh start. A real start," Sloane corrected. "No pretending, no performing, no hiding who we are to make the other person more comfortable. Just 2 people who choose to see each other clearly and love what they find there." Julian cupped her face in his hands, studying the woman who'd saved his life by refusing to let him stay small. "Mrs. Jennings," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "would you do me the honor of marrying me? Not the man I was, but the man I'm choosing to become." Sloane's smile was radiant as sunrise. "Mr. Jennings, I thought you'd never ask." Their kiss was different from any they'd shared before. Not desperate like their early romance, not perfunctory like their later marriage, but something new entirely. The kiss of 2 people who'd learned that love wasn't about completion but about choice, not about being perfect but about being real. When they finally broke apart, Julian rested his forehead against hers. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now we have a wedding to plan," Sloane said. "And a hotel empire to run. And a life to build together, one honest conversation at a time." Julian laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. Think our guests will be surprised when we renew our vows instead of signing divorce papers? I think, Sloane said, her eyes dancing with mischief, that we're going to give them a wedding they'll never forget. Outside the windows, the sun climbed higher over the city, illuminating a world full of second chances and new beginnings. And in an office where truth had once shattered everything they thought they knew about love, two people who'd learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters began planning the rest of their lives together. The hotel industry, Julian reflected, really was about hospitality, creating spaces where people could be welcomed exactly as they were, while becoming exactly who they were meant to be. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you got to do both at the same time. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this, I am sure you'll enjoy the next one. So click on the image showing on your screen to watch the next one. And don't forget to click subscribe for more beautiful stories.